the best of money matters. Wealth Tracker.
Welcome to the Wealth Tracker, where we dive into the uncharted territories of niche investment strategies that promise to redefine wealth. Hello, I'm Hongbin, Jeong. The way we save, invest, and plan for the future is evolving faster than ever. Despite a growing range of investment options and technology-driven tools, a recent Straits Times survey found that over 70% of young Singaporean employees still rely primarily on savings accounts to manage their money. So what does this tell us about risk appetite, investment culture, and the challenges of growing wealth in a world of market volatility, rising interest rates, and geopolitical uncertainty? Is your money working hard enough? Well, to find out more, I'm joined by Rohith Murthy, who is the Chief Executive Officer and Director of MoneyHero Group. Rohith, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining me here in the studio. Well, Rohith, as a fintech leader, how do you assess the current financial landscape in Singapore and across Asia?
I think when you think about money, it eventually sort of boils down to three things, right, that people are trying to do. They're trying to save money, they're trying to invest, they're trying to protect their money. And when you look at technology, over the past sort of decades, technology has always tried to rewire how people think about these things. And we've gone through a few paradigm shifts. I mean, back in the day when I started SingSaver, we didn't have information available easily. I had to literally go to every website and find the information. And now people take it for granted that you can get all the information easily and compare it and even get rich rewards.
Right.
But I think from information access, what is super exciting right now is it's now moving to a new paradigm shift, which is intelligence, where now it's no longer about just accessing information. It's about really that, having the technology that understands your personal finance. And I think that's going to be a very disruptive way of how people think about their personal finance. And I think that paradigm shift is what we are excited about, obviously, as a platform, but that's how I think it's going to change the fintech landscape.
Okay. Well, as I mentioned earlier in my introduction, a recent Straits Times survey found that over 70% of young Singaporean employees, they're relying primarily on savings accounts to manage their money. So with high reliance on savings accounts among young Singaporeans, what does this say about risk appetite and investment culture?
I did think about this question. This is an interesting, and I've read that report. I personally don't believe it's fear. I think we have to recognize the fact that young adults are growing in a very, very different world. This is a world where you have inflation spikes, you have tech layoffs, you've had the pandemic, you've had geopolitical sort of crisis. It's really not a very sort of stable, sort of environment they're growing up in. So I think they're just sequencing their risk. Because if I had to think about the decision tree with all this uncertainty around them, I guess the first reaction is, you know what, let's survive. Let's have a buffer. Let's take it cautiously. And only then, you'll see they're slowly starting to optimize, saying, okay, first thing, save the money. Then you realize inflation is hitting you. Now let's start slowly investing that in. And then there's, move forward by perhaps, into more sort of like diverse sort of assets. So I don't think this is unintentional. I think this is purely a risk sequencing that you're seeing young adults do, simply because they're living in a very different world. And I'm not even talking about technology that's just like massively changing around you.
Right. Well, then how are global factors like interest rate shifts, inflation, and geopolitical uncertainty affecting investor behavior locally if it's not fear?
Look, I think there are a few things. One is just the interest rate sort of environment. I guess for quite some time, the cash didn't really earn you anything, and now it is. So I think to a large extent that sort of reset expectations. But at the same time, you have inflation that people realize by just keeping your money and not having it do nothing is also going to cost you. And that's causing them to now sort of, starting to slowly invest, even if it's, lower sort of risk investment options. And I think finally, as I mentioned, uncertainty is causing them to really want to be in control of things. And that means knowing where the money is going, understanding, what that asset class is. And really, I think transparency is going to be super important. So I feel to a large extent, that's what's driving these things right now.
Right. Well, technology is also redefining how we manage our wealth. How can tech, empower Singaporeans to move beyond just saving and start building wealth more confidently?
A few things. I think first thing is just understanding. It's a complexity. I mean, let's face it, personal finance has been always intimidating. That's what we've been trying to attack. How do you make personal finance easy to understand? How do you break down complex sort of topics? You do that through content, but now with AI, you have a PhD in your pocket and you can learn a lot of things faster. So I think the first thing would be around that. The second thing is, we've always talked about it. How can we be more personalized? How can advice be more personalized? Typically, you had to reach out to your, broker or your agent or your wealth advisor. I think that will also slowly change with technology, especially with something like AI that can really break down a lot of things and come back and nudge and personalize. And I think finally, it boils down to the fact that, as there's trust in terms of these tools and these sort of technologies out there, it will translate to confidence. Because ultimately, it's all about, are you confident about your personal finance? But it first starts with, how well do you understand your own personal finances?
Okay. So are digital tools really lowering the barrier to entry for investments and alternative assets?
I think if you think about barriers of entry, there are probably three that you typically talk about. One has always been knowledge. And as I mentioned, that is only getting better and better with people now understanding these topics. So no longer you have to be stuck with jargons or the fine print. The second thing has been cost and access, right? Now, I think to a large extent, you are able to actually access a lot of tools even without having to put large sums of money. So I think cost and access is really improving. And finally, it's, as I mentioned, fear and trust. I mean, this has always been something that's haunted personal finance. Even if when you look at like alternative assets, when people don't understand something or they fear they're going to lose the money, there's always this trust element. So I think trust is going to be super important as you think of anything around personal finance, including, alternative investments and so on.
Right. But on the other hand, I've got a question. I mean, you're talking about how tech is making it easier for people to invest. We always talk about financial literacy here. Yeah. But at the same time, even without the whole topic of money, when we use things like ChatGPT, sometimes we're getting lazy in a way, right? We're not really going into the deep dive, researching ourselves, and we're just relying on ChatGPT. So could that be the same case for investments as well? Is that making people lazier in a way that we're not really going into that extra effort of, knowing and increasing our knowledge on what we're actually investing in?
It's a very interesting thought. And I would slightly flip it differently.
Okay.
The reason is, when you think about it, personal finance typically is very episodic. You think about insurance only when something happens to you, or, there's a turbulence in some flight, you think about travel insurance, right? So there's always been a trigger or an event. Now you have access to a technology where it can be continuous. You don't have to wait, for an event or trigger to happen. You're right. It depends on the individual, but you now have access to that. And I think the second thing is, typically the entire research process would start where people would search for information. And, that's been around for a long time. Now you have, again, a technology where you can actually research and you can converse. And that's very powerful because that's what people want. That's why, you've still had a lot of things that are not digitized where people still need to speak to an advisor and so on. And what I'm more excited about is, can this technology make personal finance more proactive? Meaning, my card bill is due, or I've been spending a lot more on a certain category. Can it actually nudge me? Can it be a coach? Can it tell me, hey, this month you seem to have changed your habits. Perhaps it's time for you to, revisit. I think that's going to be the powerful aspect of it. Now, is it going to happen overnight? No. Obviously, the technology needs to improve. People need to trust it. But I think that's going to be quite a dramatic shift for personal finance, because most of the times when you hear about people losing money, it's because they're reactive. It's because it's episodic. And it's because, they've not done the research beforehand.
Right. But where do you draw that balance of relying too heavily on AI like ChatGPT for, investment advice? Because sometimes ChatGPT, you need to double check whether or not, they're really telling the truth or the right information, right? So how do you balance your needs here? How do you balance the right way of how to use ChatGPT or other AI tools without being too heavily reliant on them?
Sure. I mean, that's where our platforms come in. Now, we do a lot of research, we do a lot of content, we do comparison, we have actual relationships with all the financial institutions. I would use it more as a co-pilot.
Okay.
You're right. It should not be the one that's flying the plane for you. You are still flying the plane, right? And you use the technology to really, start a conversation, start breaking down complex topics. And that could be a great segue to visit platforms where you then further research, you get the actual, information, there's transparency, there's choice, there's comparison, there's curation, and then you have like the real sort of, providers and products and offers. In some cases, even user-generated reviews. So I would use it still as a co-pilot, and it can do some of the things that typically would have taken a lot of time. Some of the things that typically could take us a lot of time to distill that information. So it's a co-pilot and has to be used like a co-pilot. But you're right, if you're just going to completely rely on it, the way the technology is evolving, then you risk that it could hallucinate, or worse, you could get misleading information.
So say now you're starting to, diverge out of your savings account and invest elsewhere, right? How do you start? Where do you start? What do you ask your financial co-pilot? Do you start with budgeting? Do you start with investing? Do you start straight away to stocks? Like, what are your recommendations?
Look, you always start with 3 questions, and that's been our mission, right? I'm trying to save money, so how do I go about saving my money? I'm trying to protect my money, which is less spoken about. And I want to touch upon that. The reason is people think about saving and growing their money. They don't think about protecting their money. That's where you actually risk losing a lot of your money. People still travel without travel insurance. People are still not protected when it comes to health or when it comes to certain other critical illness. So I think you have to first start with these 3 questions. And then you'll see you have the right tools, you have the right products and the right offers out there. You don't have to chase them. But these 3 questions is something that I keep asking myself every now and then. That's my financial sort of health check, right? What am I trying to achieve? And I can tell you sometimes there is an imbalance. I don't have probably the best protection now, or I've been too much focused on trying to grow my money. So I think start with these 3 questions, and then you'll see platforms, tools, apps, they're all there at your disposal. But I would always start with these 3.
All right. Well, at the same time, these AI-driven tools and alternative assets such as crypto, they open up fresh ventures, right, for wealth. How do you see alternative assets then fitting into a modern diversified portfolio?
I think the old idea of traditional versus crypto is soon becoming a false binary. I think it's no longer us versus them or this versus that. And I think to a large extent, it's because the market is maturing. There are some very clear regulations and controls, especially in our market, but also now in US. And I think what that does is now it is no longer about one asset class replacing the other, but can it enhance your portfolio? So I think to that extent, with the right controls, with the market maturing, people are now viewing this actually as a very interesting diversification. And there's still a lot of work there to be done because, again, as I mentioned, things are still complex. People still don't understand a lot when it comes to alternative investments. And yeah, that's going to take some time.
Right.
But the signs are very promising. And, if people really understand it and use it wisely, it could also be a great hedge against inflation, right? Which we've always spoken about with alternative investments. So I think that false binary is slowly disappearing, and that's great for alternative assets because previous narrative was it's either this or that, and that's soon disappearing.
And now you can have the best of both worlds.
Exactly.
Right? So what do you say are the biggest opportunities as well as risks for Singaporeans considering these types of assets?
I think the first thing is just having access. You now have access to a lot of alternative sort of, assets which you didn't have before, and that's great. And there's also the friction that's removed in terms of, how you could actually start the journey. And with that comes diversification. There's incredible diversification even there. And I think the second thing to think about, which is not going to go away, is still volatility. That's the risk and lack of understanding. I mean, we have to accept the fact that these asset classes are volatile. For me personally, I have a sleep test. If I go to bed and I'm going to lose my sleep on something where I've put my money in, then I will not put my money in it.
Yeah.
That's just my personal philosophy, right? But I do understand that it's going to be volatile. I have to understand the volatility, recognize it. And at the same time, I have to be very clear in terms of what my goals are with any asset class. So I think that risk is still there, and it's going to take some time for consumers to really understand that these asset classes are not the same as traditional asset classes.
Right. I mean, at the end of the day, you've got to get your money working for you, not the other way around.
That's correct.
Right. So, I mean, when it comes to these investments, usually people would go for the traditional, stocks, bonds, because they're well known, people are used to it, then how can fintech platforms help investors navigate these alternative assets safely?
I think it first starts with curation, and it's very important, and we do that job ourselves. It's very important that you curate licensed, regulated, trusted partners. That's the first step. Then, as I mentioned, you have to sort of start to clarify what's out there in terms of the knowledge, the information. That's going to be, your second step. And third thing is coaching. Let's face it, it requires a lot of education. I personally spend a lot of time right now even educating myself about these asset classes. So I think the role there is, can you do a really good job on curation? So there's a trust aspect, there's transparency there. Can you clarify clearly what are the risks and potentially what the returns are? And then constant coaching and education. And that's what's going to sort of help people really then invest in these asset classes.
Right. Well, we talked a lot about how technology and AI can help one's financial journey, but there's so many of them out there. There are countless of apps and tools. So how can we cut through the noise and choose the right one for us?
I told you there's three questions I always ask because I love to use new tools and apps.
Okay.
But now I've realized the most important thing is you have to be very clear in your head, firstly, of your psychology when it comes to money. Number one. Number two, what are your own personal goals? And those three questions always help me. And I can tell you every 3-6 months, I don't get the same answer. So which is saving, protecting, growing your money. Once you have that clarity, the tools will come, the right tools will discover you rather than you trying to, actually go and discover those tools. So I think to a large extent, it's great. We have a lot of tools and a lot of apps. And now you have technology like AI, which also comes with quite a, few options. But start first with your own, understand your psychology, understand what are you trying to achieve. And then you will curate and find the right tools and apps.
Right. You keep mentioning the 3 steps there, saving, protecting, and growing your money. But is there any other tips you would like to share for our listeners? Are there any steps that anyone can take this week to improve their financial health?
There's one, and I do this, and now it's also actually pretty easy with the technology available. I would take your credit card statement or bank statements, depending on what you use. Take your last 3 statements. Lock yourself for 30 minutes, no distractions, and just go through them one by one.
Oh, dear.
But no judgment.
Okay.
That's the tough part.
All right.
Do not judge. Do not make any judgments. Only make notes. And you will find some really amazing insights. You'll find patterns. You'll find subscriptions that you don't use. You'll find things where you've actually realized your habits have changed. And you make notes of those. And then you decide, okay, which are the ones you're going to retain or which are the ones you're going to reconsider. Just a very quiet exercise. But no judgment, because it's very easy. As soon as you look at your past statement, you will start making judgments. But that's not the whole purpose of it. That usually works for me. I try and do that every few months. And I realize, sometimes
you do make
my habits have changed.
Well, I do it every month as well. I look through my statements only because, when I see my credit card bill and I'm thinking, I'm pretty sure I didn't spend this much this month. And I would go back and I'll actually calculate it myself.
Right.
And it will always end up being the same amount that is listed on my app.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is a good practice. And I think we've had some great tips from you here at Rohith. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. That was Rohith Murthy, who is the Chief Executive Officer and Director of MoneyHero Group. This has been the Wealth Tracker with me, Hongbin Jeong.
Before acting on the information on Money FM, please consider if it's suitable for your own investment objectives, financial situation, and risk tolerance.
Money FM